Winston Churchill once told Stalin, "The Mediterranean is the soft underbelly of the crocodile." Churchill and the British chiefs of staff were sure that attacking German-occupied Europe through Italy would help shorten the war. The Americans were not convinced, preferring to concentrate on the decisive blow across the English Channel. Only reluctantly did they agree to join their British allies on the road to Rome. November 1942. 11 months after Pearl Harbor, the American army prepared for its first encounter with the Wehrmacht. Operation Torch, code name for the Anglo-American landings in the French North African colonies of Morocco and Algeria. They met little or no resistance from the forces of Vichy France. The French command soon broke with the government of Pétain, and their troops became part of the Allied armies. An American general, Dwight D. Eisenhower, was supreme commander. The American planners were never keen on the operation, but President Roosevelt was determined to get his ground forces into action against Hitler in 1942. Attacking the Germans in Tunisia was the next best thing to a second front in Europe. At Casablanca, within 2 months of the landings, an impressive array of British and American top brass assembled. The Russians were not present, but everybody there knew that they had to do something to take the pressure off the Red Army. Churchill and Roosevelt had now to decide where they went from here. At the beginning of 1943, the British and Americans were firmly established in North Africa. Hitler had reinforced Rommel's forces in Tunisia. But with the British Eighth Army closing from the east, it could only be a matter of time before the entire African coastline was in Allied hands. What then?
We've got to face the fact that there was a big difference between the two sides about what the future strategy of the war would be. The British Chiefs of Staff, Churchill, were all in favor of the future of the campaign being carried out through Italy and hitting at the underside of the underbelly of the Germans, moving up and eventually joining up with the Russians. The Americans held exactly the opposite view. They felt that the only way that you could defeat Germany was to take the shortest way into the center of Germany, across the Channel, and advance into the areas of the Ruhr and Saar, the great industrial areas, and then destroy the German forces by that means.
The British, led by Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, came to Casablanca determined to have their way. They got it. The Americans under General Marshall were persuaded that the next objective would be the invasion of Sicily, leading, it was hoped, to the surrender of Italy. Thus, the main Second Front was postponed for another year. At the time, however, the big news from the Casablanca conference was an unexpected pronouncement by the American president.
Mr. Roosevelt began by saying that when he was a young man, great reputation in the American military was General Grant, who had once sent an order saying that he would accept no terms but unconditional surrender, and that these, in fact, were the terms that the Allies or the United Nations wanted to present to their enemies. He then went on as though he did not understand how important a statement he had made. Mr. Churchill looked considerably surprised at this, and I think that Mr. Churchill felt that it was not the best way to present the Allied position to the enemy. However, as he said then and later, he was Mr. Roosevelt's ardent lieutenant, and he would go along with it.
After the talking, Roosevelt appeared in his other capacity, Commander-in-Chief of the American Armed Forces. If this fresh, confident-looking American army had crossed the Atlantic expecting to carry all before it, it was very soon cruelly disillusioned. In a sudden onslaught through the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, Rommel inflicted on the American army one of its worst defeats of the entire war. The Africa Corps was far too well equipped and experienced for the lightly armored and underpowered American tanks. The morale of these raw young Americans was badly shaken. Many were taken prisoner.
Brought the troops face to face with the fact that this was going to be a long war and a tough one, and the Germans were very good. Armies never learn from other armies. They have to learn by themselves, and a lot of the tactics that we used disastrously at Kasserine were those that the British Army had used equally disastrously 2 years before in the Western Desert, then discarded. I think it helped our army. It also made them realize, because the British came down from the north and did help, that this was going to be a cooperative effort, that we couldn't win it alone. And also, it got the average GI accustomed to the fact that there was going to be one battle after another.
But Rommel lacked the strength to exploit his victory. The Allies under Alexander regrouped and within 10 days retook the pass. The Germans in Tunisia were now hemmed in. The Allied sea and air blockade of the coastline made large-scale evacuation impossible. In the south, a forward patrol of the 8th Army linked up with the American Second Corps. The trap closed. Two Allied forces, once separated by 2,000 miles of mountain and desert, joined hands for the final onslaught on the German position in Africa. The Allied armies, vastly superior in numbers, drove the enemy, now without Rommel, who had been invalided home, back through the mountains of Tunisia towards the sea. The Allied air forces had undisputed control. In 7 days, it was all over. Finally, the Afrika Korps saw no point in fighting to the last man. They surrendered in droves. The unfortunate General van Arnhem, who succeeded Rommel, also surrendered with all his staff. Nearly 250,000 men were taken prisoner, a victory to rank alongside Stalingrad. This was a major boost for the British and their Mediterranean strategy. Sicily, as agreed at Casablanca, was the next item on the agenda. Only 2 months after the German collapse in Tunisia, the British and Americans began landing troops on Sicilian beaches. The British were led by Montgomery, the Americans by General Patton. The first time these two egocentric personalities had been involved in the same campaign. It was the British Eighth Army which met the fiercest German resistance. On their left, Patton's Americans swept across Sicily in style. They found useful allies in the mafia and family connections among the civilian population.
I think the situation was relieved somewhat by the fact that there was hardly a family in Sicily that didn't have relatives in the United States.
The Sicilian landing, bringing the war onto their own soil, convinced most Italians that theirs was a lost cause. Giving themselves up, if possible by the regiment, became the first objective of Italy's armed forces. Allied bombing raids on Rome provided another argument for getting out of the war. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce for 20 years, was outvoted in his own fascist Grand Council. On July the 25th, he was toppled from power. King Victor Emmanuel approved the elderly Marshal Badoglio as head of the government. Badoglio declared publicly that the war would go on, but immediately began secret negotiations with the Allies for surrender. By now, Sicily, after only a few weeks, was almost all in Allied hands. This time, there was to be no great haul of German prisoners. German evacuation across the narrow straits of Messina was highly successful. Most of the Wehrmacht's personnel got away to the mainland. Even the last guard dog. General Patton beat Montgomery into Messina. The Allies had landed in Sicily, not knowing where they would go next. With the prospect of an early Italian collapse, the British were all for attacking the mainland. The Americans agreed to a limited campaign, but insisted that Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, must take priority for resources. A secret envoy, General Castellano, was sent by Badoglio to find out on what terms Italy could join the Allies. But the Allies simply wanted Italian surrender and refused to tell Castellano of their invasion plans. partly because they didn't want the Italians to know how limited their forces were.
All we could say to General Castellano was this: well, we will tell you 2 or 3 hours before it happens, so that you can give any assistance you can to the British, to the Allied operations. Eventually, on the 3rd of September, these terms were signed.
On that day, the Allies invaded. Montgomery went across the Straits of Messina to attack the toe of Italy, but found no resistance. The Germans had moved north to counter the threat of an Allied landing further up the coast. The Italians had wanted a landing to safeguard Rome from German attack, but this was impossible. The furthest point north at which the Americans and British felt it prudent to land was nowhere near Rome, but at Salerno, as far as the Allied air cover operating from Sicily could stretch. The operation had been mounted at great speed to take advantage of the confusion in Italy. The forces at the command of the American General Mark Clark were barely adequate for the job they had to do. On the way, the troops heard a broadcast by General Eisenhower.
The Italian government has surrendered its armed forces unconditionally. As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice. The armistice was signed by my representative and the representative of Marshal Badoglio, and it becomes effective this instant.
The surrender of his allies did not take Hitler by surprise. He had already moved reinforcements into northern Italy. Here the Italians were quickly disarmed under a plan ironically codenamed Operation Axis. At this point, Hitler had not decided just where he would hold the line. The Germans entered Rome to find it a capital without a government. Badoglio and his ministers had avoided the risk of being shot for treachery by leaping into their cars and driving away. South of Rome, Clark's invasion force was nearing the beaches.
Salerno, if you go in on a boat, you'll look at the mountains that hem you in there and the passes through which you go. The enemy would be looking down your throat.
Germans were ready and waiting. After 48 hours, the Germans launched a furious counterattack. The situation in the beachhead became so precarious, Clark ordered plans for possible re-embarkation. But with massive support from air and sea, the Salerno invaders just managed to hold on. After a week of savage fighting, the Germans withdrew.
It required the intervention of all the air forces to save us at Sedan. Of all General Eisenhower's battles, that is the one where I think we were nearest to a tactical defeat.
I've never had any doubts in my mind that it was a completely successful operation. We were ordered to go in there. We were ordered to seize a bridgehead. We did it. We were ordered to capture the port of Naples. We did that within 3 weeks.
So far, so good. At least a large part of southern Italy was in Allied hands. Naples was desperately short of food. There were bread riots. Water was scarce. There was the typhus epidemic. The advance continued, but just ahead lay the line of real German resistance. The Allied commanders had hoped Hitler would withdraw further north. Instead, greatly encouraged by his near victory at Salerno, he had decided to fight here, in the mountains south of Rome. Like a bad Lira, Mussolini turned up again. He was hoisted out of his hiding place by a German rescue party and taken to Hitler. The Führer was aghast at his appearance, but thought he might still come in useful to encourage the fascists in German-occupied Italy. The German forces in Italy were led by Kesselring, one of the war's ablest defensive commanders. Kesselring had a lot going for him. The rocky spine, which runs almost the whole length of Italy, meant the Allies had to advance along the coastal plains on either side. The only way to outflank the Germans was by amphibious landings. But by now, the necessary landing craft were earmarked for Normandy. As they went north to their prepared defensive positions, Kesselring's men destroyed the only lines of communication. In the towns, the Germans left fugitives. This was Naples.
Well, they were well-trained troops. They were tenacious troops. They were well-led. And one point I like to make is they're homogeneous. They were all of one nationality. They were all equipped with the same weapons and ammunition. They ate the same food. They believed pretty much in the same God. And I had 16 different nationalities with me. some of whom couldn't eat this and couldn't eat that, and some that didn't want to fight on Fridays or some other day of the week. And the British, with their infantry weapons and your artillery completely different from ours, you couldn't move them with ease from one front to the other like the Germans could.
Winter. The Allied ground commander, General Alexander, and his colleagues were now confronted with the unpleasant realities of the Mediterranean strategy. The Eighth Army, accustomed to swift advances across the desert, could only manage a few hundred yards a day. Across the mountains, Clark's Fifth Army was also mudbound.
They issued us galoshes after the rains had stopped. And if anybody was in the galoshes business, he could have found them by the millions along the roadside because you couldn't walk with them. I mean, it was impossible to go through that mud.
This was not the sunny Italy of the travel posters.
And the only way an infantryman was going to come out of those mountains was to be carried out. And that's why it was actually desirable to get wounded.
Dreadful weather, difficult terrain, determined German resistance. For the men in the mud, this combination did not match up to Churchill's vision.
I can see him now at his map in his persuasive way with his pointer pointing out the soft belly of the Mediterranean. And after we got in there, I often thought of what a tough old gut it was instead of the soft belly that he had led us to believe.
Before the end of 1943, the Allies were hammering at Kesselring's winter line. Alexander had 11 divisions, Kesselring 9, with 8 more in reserve. Every small mountain village had to be fought for. In December, the American 36th Division tried to take San Pietro.
It was one of the things that most of our fighting was in Italy. You got into a position, you dug in, and you just stayed. I mean, we'd shoot at them and they'd shoot at us. And it was only when they were ready to leave that we moved forward.
After 10 days, the Americans took San Pietro. Heavy combat.
In any unit, you would have a graves registration unit, and their job was to go around picking up bodies. And what they would do is either if someone had been hastily buried, they would disinter him, or if he was just lying there, they'd pick him up and they would slide them into the mattress covers and pile them up into the trucks and take them off to a temporary cemetery somewhere. I suppose some Some people probably got buried as many as 4 or 5 times that way, which is kind of unfortunate, really. I always thought people should be left where they were.
The Italian people had once been told by Mussolini, war puts the stamp of nobility on those who have the courage to meet it. At Tehran in November 1943, Roosevelt and Stalin overruled Churchill and at last fixed a definite date for the landing in France, May 1944. Italy was to become a sideshow. But after Tehran, Churchill refused to accept the deadlock in Italy. He got on to Roosevelt and persuaded him to lend landing craft for a new amphibious landing. The plan was in 2 stages. First, Mark Clark's Fifth Army would attack the Germans at Cassino, draw their forces southward, drain their reserves. Then the amphibious troops would strike behind their lines at Anzio, just 22 miles south of Rome. At Cassino, the Germans held the high ground. They could see everything that moved in the valley below. The Fifth Army attacked on January the 20th. Its troops had not been reinforced. They were cold, wet, exhausted. The attack failed disastrously. But the second stage of the plan went ahead 2 days later, the assault on Anzio.
Having gone into Salerno with not enough troops, no commander ever has what he thinks he ought to have. And I was determined that if I was to be the commander going into Anzio, or be the overall commander, that we should not go in on a shoestring. I went in with 1 2/3 division, which was totally inadequate. But that's the way the ball bounces in war. You do what you're told to do, or they'll get somebody else that will do it.
The Germans expected the landing, but had no idea where it would come. They did not have enough troops to cover all the possible beaches. The Anzio force was completely unopposed.
Nothing, an odd bang in the distance, but nothing. And when dawn broke, we'd got complete surprise. And a few minutes later, along the road, there came a marvelous drunken car, swaying back and forth, just full of the most happy Germans who'd had a night out in Rome, and they were staggering back, and they couldn't believe they were captured. They said, "They're kind of camarade," and they kept on embracing me. So finally, it was for them to cling to. And that was the landing. Complete surprise.
The Anzio beachhead was consolidated in an eerie calm. After Salerno, it seemed incredible that there was no instant German riposte. Perhaps now was the time for a lightning dash in the style of General Patton for the gates of Rome. But the American commander at Anzio was no Patton. General Lucas was a cautious man who believed the beachhead must be secured before striking inland. Alexander did not overrule him. In London, Churchill complained bitterly, "I thought we'd flung a wildcat into the Auburn Hills, but instead we got a whale floundering on the beach."
there were only 2 battalions and some very old-fashioned coast batteries at the coast for defending. If the Americans had realized the situation, they could stay on the evening of the landing day in Rome.
General Lucas could, but he would have soon been met by an overwhelming force which defeated him. He'd have been defeated, no question about it. So we had to dig in on the biggest perimeter we could possibly digest and wait for the onslaught which came.
Caught off balance, as he often was by Alexander, Kesselring recovered fast. Spurred on by Hitler's demands for the immediate liquidation of the Anzio abscess, he threw all he had into the counterattack. If Anzio were eliminated, then perhaps the Allies would think again about crossing the English Channel. Allied advance units, which had spread out from the beaches, were overwhelmed by the weight of the German attack.
There was one unit I know that simply packed in, folded their greatcoats and handed themselves over. They couldn't take it anymore, and they were young, they hadn't seen this sort of thing before, and I don't blame them one little scrap.
Two American Ranger battalions were captured and humiliatingly paraded through the streets of Rome. The beachhead could only be relieved from the south by breaking through the German defensive line which ran through the monastery of Monte Cassino. Perched high above the valley, an observation post here could see everything that moved for miles around. The Allies believed, wrongly, that the monastery had been fortified.
It was the general view and the general belief of the troops who were involved on that front that Cassino, the monastery of Cassino, was being used for military purposes by the Germans. That being the case, and it also being a part of my military philosophy, and a great many other people's too, that you must not put troops into battle without giving them all possible physical and material support that you can to give them the best chance of getting a success.
On February the 15th, 1944, over 200 Allied bombers pounded the monastery into Rome. The air and ground attacks were badly coordinated, giving the Germans time to swarm into the rubble, ideal cover for defense. The Gustav line was held. At Anzio, Kesselring flung 10 German divisions against the Allies' 4.5. Hitler hoped Anzio would be a turning point in Germany's fortunes. The unit that broke through, he promised, would have the honor of escorting Allied prisoners through the streets of Berlin. Massed waves of German infantry were flung in.
They came over a moon landscape, pitted, wrecked tanks, abandoned jeeps along the road, and I still to this day don't understand the German tactics. There was a moment when you actually could see them leaving their lines like those old films of the Somme battle and falling down as our machine guns took them.
German offensive lasted 4 days. In the end, it was the Allied superiority in heavy guns that tipped the balance. It was finally beaten back. The Germans had pulled back, but the Allies still lacked the strength to break out. Stalemate.
We then had to form trenches, and Anzio then became an old-fashioned World War I trench system. And they were bombed, and they were mortared, and then they had to do trench patrols, and occasionally keen generals used to send up people to try and find out who was opposite us and do a trench raid. It was right out of Journey's End.
The two front lines were only yards apart.
A couple of fellows were cleaning this machine gun, got it all to pieces, and Irish fella named Tommy McGough was there, and he just looked up and he said, "Bloody Jesus Christ," he said, and he tried and rushed for this gun, trying to put the barrel back on it and putting it on upside down and all sorts, you know. Of course, I just looked and I said, "Quite all right, Tommy, I can see this fellow was..." I go down to the wire and he speaks very good English. He says, "Where's friend?" I said, "He's gone." "Oh," I said, "it's quite all right. What have you got?" "Danish pork and fresh lemons." Of course, we gave him a tin of bully beef, and we got talking to him about the position and the war and all that, you know, and he come from a place near Emden, was it?
Emden.
Emden. And at the time, this city had 1,000 bomber raid, you know, and I said, "Oh, you've had the bugger then." "You've had it." No, he said, "I come from a little village near Emden." He said, "Me okay," and he's showing us photos of his wife. She was a bus conductor in Emden and that. And I says, "Why don't you pack in?" I said, "You've had it now." I said, "Any time." He said, "No," he says, "German will not be beat." He says, "We shall go right down like that," he says, "till we get near to the bottom." He says, "And then we shall join forces with Britain and America," he said, "and fight Russia." And after that he just went. Well, I never seen him anymore, like he must have got relieved the next night.
Meal time, the cooks would start grub up. You go with your mess tins down. Before you could get down to the cookhouse, Anzio and he'd send one over, a big one of his cloud race, you know, and you'd automatically, as soon as that base, you'd drop to the floor. You were always used to it. You walk crowds, they call it, when you were walking about, you got the Anzio crowd.
And as you lay there, you used to tune in on radios that you shouldn't have had. And to the voice of Sally. Sally lived in Rome, and she was a great, well, she sounded the most wonderful, sexy female ever. And she kept on giving messages to the troops. Hello. One of the women always think that the lower they speak, the more sexy they sound. And she had the lowest register of any woman. She said, hello, this is Sally. Why don't you come over and see me? Private Fox, you remember him last night? He stepped on a shoe mine. Nasty thing, shoe mine. You could hear Private Fox yelling for most of the night. Don't be like Private Fox. Come over to see Sally. There would be a smart crack overhead, and down would flutter propaganda pamphlets saying, the Yanks are least lending your women. They're having a lovely time in jolly old England. There was a picture of a naked woman being embraced by an American, or an American tactfully knotting his tie while she did up her panties.
At Cassino, the Allies maintained the pressure. Their aim to tie up as many German troops there as possible. A third attempt to take the ruined monastery opened with a massive bombing attack on Cassino Tower. 500 planes went in under the sporting code word Bradman batting tomorrow. Among the places knocked for 6 was the headquarters of the British 8th Army. Once again, there was poor coordination between air and ground forces. After the bombing, the Germans came out of the ground and were in position again before the New Zealanders launched their attack. The German defenders were elite paratroops. The battle raged from house to house, room to room, cellar to cellar. New Zealanders lost 4,000 men. The Germans still held out. 3 assaults on Monte Cassino, 3 bloody failures. The Allied commanders finally realized that to take the mountain they must crush the defenders by weight of numbers. They massively reinforced the 5th Army. They used, too, an elaborate deception plan to make the Germans think they were preparing another amphibious landing north of Rome. The Germans weakened their mountain defenses to prepare for it. In May, the Allies at last outnumbered the Germans at Cassino by 3-1. After an artillery barrage by 2,000 guns, the monastery fell. Polish troops were the first to reach the ruins, where they raised their national flag. The eyes of the captured Germans told the story of their ordeal. The Germans were now in headlong retreat. Kesselring declared Rome an open city and attempted to regroup north of the camp. On the 25th of May, the Cassino front linked up with the Anzio beachhead. Alexander's plan was for Clark to cut off the Germans' retreat. Instead, Clark threw everything into a drive for Rome. He was determined to get there before anyone else, and he did. On the evening of June the 4th, 1944, the first Allied troops entered the city. Those Romans who had backed the wrong side now paid the price. Clark's Roman triumph was short-lived. Kesselring would succeed in regrouping. Another Italian winter lay ahead. And in less than 48 hours, the world's attention would turn to another theater of war, the beaches of Italy. Monsoon in Burma.
If you can imagine the heaviest rain you'd ever get in this country, going on for 6 to 8 weeks without a break, this was monsoon period.
5 months in every year.
Sloshing through mud, living in mud, lying in mud, and sleeping in mud, and drinking in mud, and eating in mud. That was a monsoon in Burma. It's just a nightmare.
War in Burma made up in ferocity what it lacked in scale. Here in 1944, in these conditions, the British were defending the frontiers of India against the Japanese. The Burmese jungle, a steam bar closing out the sky, a dense, imprisonment, and a long way from home.
I'd never seen a jungle. I'd seen a forest, but I hadn't seen a jungle. We went in there, dark, dirty, damp, rain. There's all sorts of animal noises that we never heard before. In actual fact, it was really scary.
I like the jungle, and it did not have the fear it seems to have had for some of the Allied soldiers. It was a friendly place, dark, where you could cover yourself and camouflage yourself.
Burma. Jagged mountain and fetid swamp, clothed in jungle and scored by steep river valleys. Burma. Endless green growth spawning every kind of disease. Malaria, dysentery, scrub typhus, dengue fever, prickly heat, particularly in monsoon. Mud. It might have been Flanders in the First World War. The monsoon in Burma turned camps into swamps, roads into quagmires. After the rain, the country was just one great bowl of mud. For the British, Burma was a shield and barrier protecting their Indian empire. The Japanese saw they could use Burma to screen their new territorial gains in Southeast Asia, to cut the Allied supply route to China, and to secure new sources of oil and rice. In December 1941, they invaded. They had the advantage of surprise, and for this jungle war, they were thoroughly prepared.
I don't think any country could have been more unprepared for war than Burma was at this particular time. The government was unprepared, the civil organization and the people were unprepared, and the defense forces practically didn't exist.
Some of the Gurkha who came along had 400 recruits straight from the depot. And the British had been milked of reinforcements and officers to Europe, and you might say only the dull left behind.
The Japanese from the start swept all before them. They used the jungle to outmarch and outmaneuver Britain's weak Burma army. The British retreated in confusion.
It was a crashing disadvantage to me in the 1942 campaign in that I hadn't got a wireless set which would contact my air support in Rangoon. And therefore, believe it or not, the only thing I could do was to tap in onto the railway telephone line, get the Babu in the post office in Rangoon, and try and persuade him that it was vitally important for me to be put on to Air Force headquarters. And that was really one of the reasons why, in our withdrawal to the Sitan, we were terribly badly bombed by the RAF as well as by the Japanese Air Force.
The Japanese had heavy air superiority. They bombed and strafed almost at will, spreading terror among raw troops and civilians. Only a small force of American volunteers and the few RAF planes that were in Burma challenged their dominance and rose to battle with them. damage the Japanese bombers dealt was, as much as anything, psychological. People couldn't believe this was happening to peaceful Burma. Resistance, valiant at times, was swept aside.
I was discharged from hospital at Mandalay having broken 3 ribs, left absolutely stranded on the roadside. And a civilian picked me up, took me home to his house and said, what did I do? And I said, I'm catering. Well, he said, if you like, you can come to our house and cook for us. We were there 2 hours, no more than that, when the message came through, evacuate, the Japanese are here.
The Japanese march north continued, leaving a trail of chaos and destruction the length of Burma. The British retreated.
I had nothing, only what I stood up in. I raided someone's kit, found a stout pair of boots, and we began to walk.
In the mounting confusion, the wounded were a problem.
We had to leave, giving treatment and just bandage up, do best we could. Some we had to leave behind, others that we could put on transport to get them on the roads. This was all we could do, and eventually we had to finally give it up as a bad job and make our own way out, as we were only 24 hours in front of the Japanese by the length of the Burma.
The Japanese took everything in their stride. Ahead of them, the last recourse of the retreating army, scorched earth. The invaders seemed to have made the jungle their friend. They were racing to win the rich prize of Burma's oil, but found instead a blazing inferno. At one installation, 11 million pounds worth of oil and plant went up in 70 minutes. Refugees, Eurasians, Chinese, Indians.
Indians we saw die on the roadside. We just could do nothing about it. We just had to think about ourselves and go on.
Japanese were driving Burma people in their thousands. They were coming through. There were some terrible sights up there. Men were left behind. It was heartbreaking very often just to see them being separated from their people, wondering whether they'd ever meet up with them again. They were dying in their hundreds. Well, all they used to do then was just pile them up and throw petrol over them and set fire to them, and that was the end of those.
We had to hack our way through virgin jungle practically to get out of that country. And we had to find our own way to India. I think the overall impression I had of that horrible trek out of Burma was that it seemed to bring the best and the worst out of people. Some people who I'd looked up to and respected, I found I couldn't respect anymore because they became entirely different on that march. In fact, I felt that it was